Hey guys, welcome back to the show. So today we are going to discuss about starting a podcast. A lot of people on my Instagram are asking me about successful podcast or how to start a successfully good podcast, a decent podcast. But first you need to understand few things, okay? Because I started a podcast, I recorded like 6-7 episodes and then I completely shut it down because I was thinking that maybe this is not something I wanted to do. So my first podcast, the initial name of the podcast was called 4 Questions with Social Media Famous, and I was calling social media famous people in this hope that if I interview them on a podcast, they'll share my podcast, I'll get more views. But the whole purpose was to get more views and starting a podcast. And I completely shut it down because I was into social media marketing, but that wasn't the right way to go about it. And then I again restarted a podcast after a year. And this was the first time Corona wave hit. And there were so many businesses that were struggling, especially my friends. A lot of those people own Shopify stores. A lot of those people were starting the new e-commerce business, Amazon stores, local bars, restaurants, and I have a huge network of people, and they were always asking me advices, this, that, and all on my Instagram. So I thought, how about I do one thing? Every time someone asks me for advice, I'll just record few episodes and I'll just give them the link to the episode. And maybe if I want to continue it, I'll continue it. But that's the easiest way. Even any brand owner I'm consulting with for SEO services or doing consultation for their website SEO, I'll just give them this link and this will be my knowledge resource where I can just give it to people. And obviously it will be public. Eventually, when I started making it, it was good, not much traction, but slowly, as I have shared it more, it got picked up. So today we are just going to talk about making a podcast. By the way, it picked up to a height after creating it for a year. The one secret is consistency. Okay, right now we have more than 38,000 followers online, plus 100K plus downloads to this podcast. So the only thing I can talk about, like I'm going to create another episode on marketing the podcast, but even if I wasn't marketing it well and just distributing, we would have reached somewhat similar number. The whole secret to this is that consistency. And the one thing makes me really happy that there are some people who are listening to my podcast and they are on the podcast app just to listen to my podcast. Like I get such reviews and comments on regular basis that they started listening to my podcast and that was just the only podcast they are listening to because of that knowledge I'm providing. And they are not a usual podcast listener. They started listening to my podcast. Now they are discovering other podcasts, which makes me really happy that I'm bringing some of really great people from other channels to podcast channel. And yeah, so there are a lot of ways to start a podcast, but one of the major problems when people are going to start a podcast, they go into the mindset of perfection, especially when it comes to video and audio platforms. I mean, you can write a blog and you can keep editing it later to make it perfect. But when it comes to video and audio platforms or people who want to start that kind of content creation, they go into this mode of perfection and they want to create a perfect thing. But it's okay to not create a perfect thing. I mean, this podcast, I'm not even kidding, I never edit this podcast. This is gonna go original. Even if I cough on this podcast, I don't pause or anything. I don't edit it. I just put a clean intro to it and then it's online. That's what I don't want to put efforts, because this podcast, this is not something I make money from. Maybe I get some consulting clients here and there through the podcast or through LinkedIn, but this is not something what I want to do full time. So I don't care that much about the quality of the podcast. I don't care what kind of mic and all. Like before this mic, I was using a 3,000 rupees mic. I mean, that's the cheapest thing on Amazon for a podcast mic. And I purchased it and used it for a year. Okay. And what you need to do is for a start, Stop caring about, like, no one have first 10 episodes which are perfect, but you have to understand, if you create more than 10 episodes, you are above, I think, in out of 3 million podcasts online, only 1 million podcasts have more than 10 episodes. Rest, most of them stop podcasting after 3 or 4 episodes because they think that they are not able to continue with it. They are not able to find the correct guest. They are not able to, like, there are a lot of struggles. But if you are not consistent, doesn't matter how much perfect your 4 or 5 episodes are. And first, another thing that demotivates a lot of people is listeners. Like, when I started, for I think first 6 months, I did not promote the podcast. I just had like 6 to 8 downloads per podcast. That's the maximum number I used to reach for like whole thing. And I used to think that I'm creating this podcast, but I won't complain till I'm done with first 100 episodes. And I didn't complain till I was done with 150 episodes. Then I took a break for 20 days and I created the transcript of podcast and started promoting it here and there on different platforms. And I got a lot of people started listening to it. But do not care whenever you are going into content creation. Okay, like YouTube, right now my YouTube channel gets hardly 35 to 40 views per video. I really don't care. I mean, I'm gonna complain, I'm gonna start marketing only once 100 plus videos are online and I have given my best. And now is the time when I really want to go ahead and market it. Till then, I really don't care how many viewers I'm getting. It's about creating that particular number. Okay, so all you need is a good mic, decent mic. Any mic will do. Don't get too much into complication. Intro is very important. You can find someone on Fiverr for $30-40 to create an amazing intro. I like the rap music. You can go with like someone introducing you, someone talking about podcasts. There are so many good intros out there. Just figure out a theme and find someone on Fiverr for intro. Minimum, like, do you know, like the biggest, I can record 3 podcasts. I have done, by the way, 12 podcast episodes in a day and distributed it across for 12 days. And I have done that a lot of times. Okay. It's not that difficult. Writing topics for 12 podcasts is the toughest thing. So whenever you are going into podcasting, if you have 30 topics written for 30 episodes, okay, or if you are going into a format which we are gonna talk about, always have the topics written. If you have the topics written, then it'll make it easier. You'll feel less lazy about starting a podcast. That's what I believe. Like, if I have a topic written, I feel like just opening up my mic, setting up a camera and recording it. If I don't have a topic written, then I can delay it for a week and keep thinking about what to create a new podcast about. So keep 30 topics. Okay, topics means like the heading of the podcast, plus there are subheadings, like there are small pointers that keep reminding you how deep you want to go with the podcast. Another thing is fix the frequency. Always think in mind that how, like, do you want to go for a longer podcast or a shorter podcast? If you want to go for, let's say, 1 hour podcast, then you cannot go 3 times or 5 times in a week, or maybe daily podcast. Daily podcast was supposed to be shorter. Like this one, shorter podcast, 10 to 15 minutes max. I want to keep it to 6 to 8 minute tips. Perfect. Okay. If you want to go for a longer podcast like 1 hour and all, I would suggest a weekly podcast. If you are interviewing guests, do you want to create individual content? Do you want to bring in guests? Do you want to mix? Like, I mix it. If I find someone really interesting, I interview them. Otherwise, I mix it. And I personally don't enjoy too much of 2 people podcast, like where there is a guest coming and guest is always telling their personal story, which is not actionable tips. So I don't enjoy them. That's why I try and avoid those kind of podcasts or recording those kind of podcasts. But yeah, so fix that, fix the frequency. Don't go for daily. It's a burnout. Like, I tried going for 7 episodes a week for very long. I think for 5 or 6 months I did that. and it's a constant burnout. And I realized the quality of the podcast was going down because I kept repeating the same things. It wasn't giving me enough time to consume, it was just giving me enough time to create. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Another thing is guest or individual. Like, do you want to do individual or do you want to bring in a guest? Always think about it. Bringing in a guest, I'm going to talk about it in marketing strategy, how to bring in guest, how to find your guest and all. So when I create next episode of marketing a podcast, I'm going to talk in that. Good image. Yeah, you need a good image as your podcast title, something a graphic designer would have done, your face or anything, your face and something written about your podcast or your podcast name. So that can give you a lot of more clicks through in Spotify and Apple. They both use clickbait as the image. So that's something that you can consider. Okay, now that was about starting a podcast. Now let's talk about making a podcast. Don't complicate making a podcast. Go to any platform. Like my podcast is hosted on Spreaker. I don't care what features Anchor or other platform has. Go for Anchor. Go for any other platform. It literally doesn't matter. There are hardly a difference between features or prices. Okay, so go for any platform that you like. Almost all the platforms will have the distribution side of the podcast. When I talk about distribution side of the podcast, it means like they will themselves distribute your podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon and other places where you need to bring your podcast. You can also Google that podcast distribution sites and you just have to submit your RSS feed and it just gets on it. So it's not that complicated. Don't think too much about the platform. Go for any platform that's available. Second thing, editing the podcast. I think the tool name is Audacity. Yeah. So Audacity is the tool we use personally to edit the podcast. I use it because I just have the intro and then I have the podcast recording. I just put the intro and it's literally copy pasting intro in front of that and you are done. Like it's the free and the most simple software. You just go on YouTube, how to edit a podcast on Audacity. Within 5 minutes you'll learn. Like it's so simple tool. Don't think about it, just go ahead with that. Third thing, rabbit hole of editing. Don't get into a rabbit hole of editing. I personally, like, people want to remove blank spaces and all. People want to remove wherever they were stammering. I literally say sometimes, like, make big mistakes between has and have. I make big mistakes and stammer. Sometimes I keep repeating myself. Sometimes I lose the thought, but I never edit my podcast. It's such a huge time consuming thing that one of the reason I started with podcast, not YouTube videos or anything else, is because I just wanted to talk like what usually people talk like. Even if I go and write like my newsletters, if you go and read, it's literally like you and me talking. I don't care what and how people write blogs or what's the trend about it. So if you really want to get into it, don't waste time. Hire someone who's a professional audio editor. They are again very cheap in the market. Go ahead and send your MP3 of that and go with that. And then nothing, like record your podcast, upload the MP3 with intro from Audacity and upload it on the platform. Then the platform will distribute your podcast. It's as simple as that, starting a podcast. Now marketing it will be a second episode I'm going to create on this, but that's a little more complicated. There are not like one or two techniques to do it. There are like thousands of techniques to market your podcast. So when you market your podcast, you have to market yourself as a co-host. Okay, so there are like a lot of ways to market it, and I'm going to talk about that in the next episode. And yeah, I guess this is it, guys. So this is what I wanted to talk about, starting a podcast for those people who really want to start it. I just want to say, just start it. I mean, don't make it too complicated. You want to start, and once you started, don't stop. Like every time you start a content or content channel or starting to create content, 100 is the minimum number. I really don't care. I mean, for Instagram, I might say 300 is the number or 365 days is the number. But for podcast or videos or any other competitive channel you want to get on, 100 is the number. I mean, anyone can market their things or go viral overnight, this, that, and all. One thing no one can beat or no one can take away from you is consistency of creating content. And I keep saying that whether you are a blogger or vlogger or anything, no one is watching you, it's okay. Don't think about changing your content or changing your style as per people. If you are talking and if you are genuinely giving right information out in the market, people will start listening to you. Second thing, last thing I want to say before I end this podcast: don't start a podcast for fame. Don't start a podcast for money. There is no fame in it. There is no money in it. Hardly any money in it, I would say. There is no, it's not YouTube. It's not YouTube channel. You won't become a celebrity overnight. No one gives a flying F about a podcast. Okay. So think about it. If you start your podcast, is there genuine information that you want to give out to the world? Is there something that you really want to contribute towards? Is this the topic that you can wake up middle of the night at 3 and talk about? Okay. If it is, then start a podcast. Don't do it for the returns which people think they'll get. They'll become Joe Rogan or maybe Beer Bicep or something. It won't happen. It's too tough to do that. Okay. So think about it in the long term. Yeah. And yeah, I guess this is it. If you guys love the podcast, please leave me a review, watch my YouTube channel, connect with social media platforms. I drop regular basis. I drop amazing tips and newsletter, one of my favorite channels where I'm concentrating the most right now. Go ahead and subscribe to that, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.